agree that those problems are out there and need to be fixed. But don't turn the entire system on its head and destroy what is working for, whether it's 58, 59, or 60% of the population of the United States. That's still a pretty good chunk of people. And if you upset the apple cart for them, they're going to be upset with you. And then the other thing that was said to us over and over again, but we are concerned about the cost. And if you do anything, let's work on that. So what are the two things we did? We turned the whole system on its head, and we didn't do anything about the cost. In fact, you could argue that we bent the cost curve dramatically in the opposite direction. And in my opinion, that's what happened. Now, Ron's got a great idea, and he's going forward with this. But again, the problem is there's already a bill that's been signed into law. I mean, this thing is going forward at breakneck speed. One of the things that concerns me greatly as a legislator, and I do want to talk a little bit before I finish up about what this has done to my perception of what this has done to medicine as a profession. But let me just talk from the perspective of a legislator for a moment. We have put so much power, we've taken it from the legislative branch and just given it to the executive branch and said, figure it out, do something with this, take it to the federal agencies, and somehow, somewhere in 2014, when it's going to come out the other end, is something that will solve the problem for people. It doesn't work like that. You know that. I know that. We have not had a single oversight hearing in my little humble subcommittee of oversight and investigations. We have not had a single hearing on the oversight of the implementation of this law since it was signed back in March. That's a long time. That's a lot of water under the bridge. Now, arguably at first, when we were agitating for hearings in May and June, you could say, well, wait, there hasn't been time. Give the secretary some time and space to set this thing up. But we're 7, 8, going on 9 months afterward. 9 months, you can make a new person. I know that from my previous profession. But in 9 months' time, there's a lot of water that's gone under the bridge. And so we have entirely new federal agencies that are being created that were never called for in the legislation. The Office of Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight, or whatever the acronym is, nowhere in the legislation does it call for that to be formed. And yet, there is a new federal agency called the Office of Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight. They've rented space out in Bethesda. They've hired, 300 new people to work there. And no one in Congress has a clue about what they're doing. No one in the country would have known about them had it not been for the McDonald's Corporation, who said, we can't live like this. You've got to do something. The administration recognized the peril that they were in a few weeks before the election. And in October, this little obscure brand new federal agency began issuing waivers. And first was just a dribble here, 1 or 2 were coming out, and then right before the election, I don't remember how many that were on the website, but certainly over 100, and I don't know what's happened since then. But wait a minute, what are the rules regarding waivers? I have people in my district coming up to me saying, look, I got a 12-person pizza franchise, and I'd like to get one of these waivers. Where do I sign up? I don't know what to tell him, for crying out loud. Well, my committee, my subcommittee of Oversight and Investigations on the Committee of Energy and Commerce should have had this group in at some point to talk about it. We should have had the secretary in to talk about this. For crying out loud, Donald Berwick, who I don't know, but I have met, and I know he's one of the smartest people on the planet. I certainly don't relish the thought of having to go toe-to-toe with him in committee, but we didn't go through the normal Senate confirmation process. Nobody in the country knows who he is or what his thought processes are. And as a consequence, here we have someone making enormously important decisions at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And for those of you functioning at the state level, that Medicaid part of Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services is often forgotten, but extremely important. That's going to affect everything that happens in the state budgetary process going into this next year as they have to deal with all of these new Medicaid beneficiaries. Now, Senator Wyden talks about his ideas and how they would have to meet the benchmarks that have been set in the existing law. Okay, that's great. What about the existing law that says everybody under 133% of federal poverty is automatically a new Medicaid recipient? I mean, that's happened. That's already there. That's baked into the cake. You can't go back and undo that, in my opinion, unless you repeal the entire bill. Now, will we have a repeal vote in the House of Representatives? Yeah, we will. We recognize we didn't win the Senate. We recognize the White House is still occupied by the individual who thought that this was the greatest achievement ever. So we recognize some of the difficulties that we're up against, but I think it is important for the country to see a repeal vote on this bill come from the People's House, and I believe that they will see that. But that doesn't mean that we stop there. certainly the oversight part of this is going to be extremely important, and beginning to educate people about what is actually contained in that bill, because after all, it was the Speaker of the House that said we've got to pass the bill so you know what's in it. Well, now we've got to do some oversight so you can really understand what's in that bill, and as more that people begin to peel back the layers, the less there is to like. In my opinion, for what it's worth, as I saw some of you were carrying in the chart that was prepared by another committee on which I sit, the Joint Economic Committee, that chart is startling, to say the least, of the new federal agencies and bureaucracies that are created in this healthcare law. There's also another chart, which is the timeline chart that Center for Health Transformations has put out. You put those two things up side by side, as I did during my town halls this summer, and people are quite startled by what they see and are quite concerned. Now, one place where I will take exception, another place I will take exception to what Senator Wyden said, you don't fix this problem. What did people tell us in August? Don't pass a 1,000-page bill. So what did? We came back with a 2,000-page bill, and the Senate gave us a 2,700-page bill with 300 pages of corrections afterwards. That just set people off. What if we had come at this from a standpoint of, well, let's fix the problems. We all acknowledge that there are problems there. To say that Republicans had no ideas is to not really be giving credit where credit is due. I maintain a website, healthcaucus.org. I had 9 things up there, each that had a specific piece of legislation tied to it. Usually those bills ran 45 to 75 pages long. They weren't all mine, but the best ones were. But nevertheless, there were 9 things you could do right now. Some, in fact, would really just require some administrative changes at CMS in order to get those things working. HR 4019 and 4020. You want to deal with pre-existing conditions? You want to do so in a way that doesn't bankrupt the states? Nathan Deal, who's now the governor-elect of Georgia, and I sat down to do that. Since Nathan was already announced as running for governor of Georgia, you can be sure that there were no additional state mandates in that, because he was concerned about what we're going to do for costs of the state. But if you make the individual market in some ways look a little bit more like the group market, if you in fact allow for a federal share, a state share, and yes, the private sector contributing some, whether it be through premium support or direct contribution, there are ways you can get to ensuring a great number of people who are right now excluded with so-called pre-existing conditions. And it doesn't break the bank for the otherwise cohort of individuals who are buying insurance in the open market, who don't want to have to cover everything else that everyone, the expense that putting everyone into the same bucket the community rating is going to cause. But there are ways to do this. We never had those discussions. We never had those discussions. At least on the House side, we put this thing through regular order, and it did go through 3 committees. I had 50 amendments prepared in the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. We spent 10 days on the bill, which is exactly 9 days longer than the 2 other committees of jurisdiction. In my committee, we had a table for the Democratic amendments, a table for the Republican amendments, and the table for the Burgess amendments. We got to 5 of mine. A few of them were actually incorporated, but then they got stripped out when it went through the Speaker's office. But in the end, it didn't matter, because the House bill was a dead duck after it passed on November 11th of last year. Took up the Senate bill, and that no one ever intended for that thing to see the light of day as law, but that's what happened. Scott Brown got elected. Oh my God, we don't have 60 votes. And the best thing to do was to simply bring this thing back to the House. It was a House bill number on the bill. I would refresh your memory. It was not a health care bill when the House passed it the first time. It was a housing bill dealing with veterans and housing. And it was, I voted against it, but arguably that was, it had a place. All the housing language stripped out of it, health care language inserted. So what that means is, number one, since it was primarily a tax bill, it had to originate in the House. So it did. It fulfilled that criteria. And then number two, it never had to go to a conference committee. It never had to have the rough edges knocked off. Simply bring it back to the House. Will the House now concur with the Senate amendment to HR 3590? And that's exactly what happened. Short trip down to the White House, signing ceremony, signed, sealed, and delivered. And